that the Institute for Culture and Society has been running around research development more broadly. And in particular today, we're looking at research in times of uncertainty. And to begin, I'd like to note that today's meeting is being chaired on the boundary between Gadigal and Wongal country. And I wish to acknowledge Indigenous custodians of this country, past, present, and future. So shortly, Heather will provide an introduction to this particular seminar that we're running. And for now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ned Rossiter, and I'll be chairing this meeting in my capacity as Director of Research at ICS. We can say more in just broad general terms that our experiences over the last year have been kind of paradoxical in all sorts of ways, to put it mildly. Despite, ongoing constraints and restrictions and confinement, on a daily basis during this current lockdown we're experiencing, despite that, research only seems to become more complicated. And that's one of the kind of points of tension and sort of sites of address, if you like, that we'll be looking to unpack further today in the talks that we have by 5 of our great researchers in the university. I will just be playing a fairly marginal role in today's proceedings, keeping people on time. If people would like to have questions, we'll have a little bit of time after each speaker for a question, and we can open that up further towards the end. If you have any questions or queries along the way, well, the chat function is probably the best place to register those, and I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll pick up on them. So without any kind of further ado, I'd like to hand over to Heather Horst, Director of Research, Director at the Institute for Culture and Society.
Thanks so much, Ned, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us. So today's seminar is an opportunity to reflect upon our research practice in a time of uncertainty. Sociologist Christine Hein has used the term adaptive methods to discuss the ways in which research often requires new forms. As she observes, adaptive methods can be a response to time limitations, the distributed nature of field sites, the nature of the analytical units, or the interdisciplinary foci that they take. Now, over the past year or so, the conditions and possibilities of our research have been shaped by public health orders, perceptions and parameters of risk, ongoing border restrictions, as well as our own concerns as researchers about issues of ethics and responsibility. And these in turn have impacted upon the processes of knowledge production. So as you'll hear a bit today, many of our researchers have developed creative workarounds for rethinking how, when, and where research can and should take place. And one of the interesting dimensions of adaptive methods is that they can also lead to adaptive concept that, if developed in dialogue with theory, can actually shape the theoretical interventions of our work. But adaptation during a pandemic, let alone any other time, is not a monolithic process. Adaptive methods and concepts have distinctive expressions that are directly linked to the research questions, research practices, participants, as indeed the partnerships that really do drive our work. So this afternoon, we've invited 5 panelists who will speak to the adaptive methods and practices that they have developed during different phases of the pandemic. And this particular point is one that I want to emphasize here. You'll hear about research that's taken place during openings, as well as closures of borders, field sites, homes, schools, and so on. All 5 researchers are based in the Institute for Culture and Society and/or the Young and Resilient Research Center, and will be introduced by Ned as we move throughout our program. So in terms of format, we've asked each panelist or set of panelists to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a few questions afterwards, perhaps for about 1 or 2 questions. We ask that the questions for the panelists try to come in through the Q&A function so that we can keep this session as tight as possible. And with that, I'll turn it back to our chair, Ned. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heather. We'll begin today then with our first speakers, with Professor Megan Watkins and Professor Greg Noble, who've been working at the intersection of education and culture for many years. So thank you, Megan and Greg.
Okay. Thanks, Ned. So, so Greg and I will be very briefly looking at the challenges of researching in schools during COVID. I just wanted to say a little bit upfront about the project that we're working on, which is an ARC discovery called Schooling, Parenting, Ethnicity, focusing on Asian migration and education and Australian education. So what our project is doing is looking at the home and school practices of families from diverse ethnic and SES backgrounds in 6 primary schools. There's something quite specific about these primary schools. They don't just have a particular ethnic makeup, and the students aren't just from particular SES backgrounds. We also chose the schools because we wanted to get a range of schools that were selective schools or broad-based to look at kind of parenting decisions around this. It also considers values, but importantly practices in terms of the role of parents in their students' schooling. And this focus on practices becomes important when we talk about some of the issues that we confronted, particularly around COVID during the research. You can see the team there, and I just want to say something quickly about the different phases of the research. It's a project that focuses on mixed methods, but it's heavily skewed towards ethnographic methods. So the first part of the project, the first phase, is a parent survey. But this is primarily, well, giving us broad-based information, but it's primarily a kind of recruitment tool. After that, we were the families that we recruited in each of those 6 schools, we then interviewed parents, home observations, which presented numerous challenges. We had time use diaries, how the kids spent their time. Then also, which we haven't done as yet for obvious reasons, school and classroom observations, interviews with students, parents and teachers, focus groups, and also we're going into tutoring colleges to do both observation and interviews. So some of the key problems that we have faced is that last year, when COVID hit and we commenced the project, we had initial delays getting into schools. After the first lockdown, there were difficulties getting schools to give us time and input. And I mean, this is obviously understandable. I mean, they're confronted with their own problems about ensuring that children and parents are suitably resourced, if you like, around homeschooling. And so they didn't really want pesky academics around saying, well, look, we want to do our research. So we were also confronted with hesitancy from parents. A lot felt really overwhelmed with what was happening around homeschooling. And once again, they were reluctant to give us their time. The second lockdown this year has interrupted interviewing and home visits, and Greg's going to say a little bit about how we dealt with that. And what we are currently focusing on and are confronting are delayed returns to schools. This current lockdown has been a major issue because we were hoping to do classroom-based research. Just to sort of sum up before I pass it over to Greg, what has been a key issue that we have had to confront to this point is the managing of gatekeepers. To actually to be able to access the participants in our study, we actually have to go through schools. And so managing relations with schools, primarily principals, has been very time consuming and has been quite difficult. What is another key problem is when COVID actually takes over and has a huge impact on the nature of your research. Because our focus is looking at practices in the home and in school around children's learning, COVID obviously impacts that. We didn't really want to see what happened in the home during homeschooling. We have actually modified the study in some ways to to allow us to collect data on that, but we really wanted to avoid that to some extent. But without taking up too much time, I'll pass over to Greg now, who can talk about what we actually did in relation to some of these problems.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll talk about two broad areas: the responses in relationship to school communities and responses in terms of us as researchers. But let me first just make the point, kind of summarising from what Megan has said, that you know, we often talk about engaged research at the ICS and the importance of that and the way we do it and how it differs from what other people do. But in fact, engaged research always poses the problem of the possibility of disengaged research. I mean, that's exactly what we've been grappling with. It's not just that. There have been moments of lockdown or issues around exposure sites. But even in the periods in between periods of lockdown, there's been a kind of a downturn of enthusiasm because schools are trying to grapple with a whole range of things. We don't really have anything particularly profound to offer, really, because really what it came down to was a mixture of patience, perseverance, and flexibility. So obviously, when things have hit schools quite badly, we actually just had to back off. The last thing that schools needed was more and more pressure from academic researchers. At the same time, we wanted to maintain rapport. So backing off but staying in touch was kind of still really important. So we had to kind of keep schools in the loop in terms of what was going on or not going on. It also meant that we actually had to kind of do something similar with the New South Wales Department of Education, who have been very supportive and very helpful, even though they weren't an official partner of the project. So again, we actually had to keep them and the other members of the advisory board in the loop, have separate consultations with them, seek their advice when particular problems came up. So it was really about maintaining particular kinds of relationships with the participants in the project at all levels, schools, parents, Department of Education, and so on and so forth. It also meant we had to find alternatives, or as it's been worded in the document, workarounds. And that involved a number of things for us. The first was that the initial survey was meant to be open for a couple of months. In the end, I think it was open for about 9 months. Is that right, Megan? About 9 months. So we had to kind of keep extending it because of the kind of the issues around getting people to be involved. Even when lockdown itself wasn't an issue, there was that kind of a lethargy about engaging with staff. We also had to kind of look at recruiting in different ways and being a bit more creative about how we got people involved, and that involves some consultation with the schools and the department. But we had to start resorting to Zoom interviews, doing interviews at schools for a start, because people actually became quite anxious about having people in their homes, and then doing Zoom interviews where that anxiety meant that we could really only solve it in terms of Zoom. And perhaps most interestingly, it also involved enrolling parents and students in the research process, the data gathering process. So where we wanted to spend a lot of time in homes, and that became harder and harder, we then asked people to start sending us pictures of what they were doing. So, so here are a bunch of pictures, some of which we've taken and some of which the parents or children have taken. And I'd love to be able to talk at length about this, but we're not here to talk about the content. But this is a lot of fun. Spend some time analysing this. But yeah, so the point was that we actually got some parents and some students to start providing this data for us, and in some cases having little text or email exchanges about why they were doing this and what was significant, and some follow-up issues. So the extension of the interviewing process and the ethnographic process into electronic means, even though that we hadn't actually intended to do that. So we can move on to the next one then. Yeah, so so working with school communities was one thing, but we also had to have responses for us as a team of researchers. And again, it kind of came down to questions of patience, perseverance, and flexibility. So on the one hand, we just kind of shifted our attention to doing lots of tasks that we were originally going to leave till much later. So we started spending a lot of time looking at the survey data, cleaning up the interview data. We've started doing some preliminary analysis of the interview observations and what time you started that we've accrued. So just kind of finding the tasks to kind of keep the momentum going. So, but the really difficult problem was staying in the groove, keeping kind of the intellectual focus on what we were doing, and as a team of scholars, and as trying to maintain our focus on the research object, as Megan kind of indicated before. And Megan's just going to conclude with a couple.
Ned, I'm just going to spend 30 seconds saying, and further problems that we had are issues around managing PhD students, one of which I think is here with us today. This is very difficult for students to commence their PhD in the middle of COVID, and they have to find new ways of recruiting participants for their studies. Managing research staff. If you have a budget with the ARC and you have a particular timeline, you've employed somebody, but their timeline shift. So having to balance that, what they are actually doing with the budget that is always there guiding what you're doing. University support. We found that there were some issues around risk management procedures that really didn't understand the nature of ethnographic research. I think they're there to support researchers, but sometimes it can be a bit of a problem because by its very nature, ethnographic research is unpredictable, and we can't necessarily always determine what is going to be a risk in a particular research site. I don't want to take up any more time, so we'll leave it there, and I'll pass it back to you, Ned.
Thanks a lot, Megan and Greg. Certainly the amount of bureaucracy that's amplified during this period is sort of something else we could dissect quite a lot. Any questions before we move to our next speaker? There are none in the chat. Feel free to enter them there, but we can also accommodate the impromptu question. We've got a little bit of time.
Just a question from me. I've also tried to work with schools during this period. Have you been able to answer your research questions? Have you been able to approach the research aims in a robust enough way, do you think, Megan and Greg?
Well, so far, I mean, the big challenge will be for the next phase of the research, which is about classroom-based research. And, even with all the, newfangled ways of approaching ethnography through platforms like Vimeo and whatever, you really need to be within a classroom to be able to capture what's happening. So that's going to be something that we we'll be thinking about for next year, and crossing our fingers that we're actually going to be able to undertake that kind of research. So I can't answer that one just yet. So far, it hasn't been too bad, but we may have to pivot once again in terms of how we approach this next phase of research.
I mean, it sure looks like you're shaping up to be media ethnographers with the kind of software interfaces. So I guess that would be the obvious question for me. To what extent is the software shaping the kind of discussions you have and the data you gather? I
don't know if Greg wants to pop in there. Look, I think some of the software is, look, it's okay. Like I think it's okay having parents and students send you photos and videos of, study sites within the home and things like that. But there are things that I think it's really important that are actually guided by the researcher themselves, and things that we want to see that we can't necessarily rely on the participants providing. One of the most obvious things, as I've just said, is in the classroom. So, I mean, I don't know if Greg necessarily wants to add to that in terms of the ways in which the technology has shaped the nature of the data that we're collecting, but beyond that. Greg?
Yeah, just simply that, to reinforce a point that Megan made, if you ask people to give images of certain things, then they give you images of what they think is important. Whereas as ethnographers, ethnographers in a site, we might actually have other expectations. So it's trying to manage that process. The time use diary, I think it's been, we haven't really worked out whether that's successful yet, because that kind of stopped in the middle of the process. We really only got about, not even halfway through that, about a third. So we don't quite know what to do with that. In terms of using Zoom interviews and kind of a series of text chats, that seems to work out okay. But you know, you lose that kind of face-to-face rapport.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, the fact that there are multiple data sources sort of allows you to sort of to some extent make allowance for, you know, what I suppose we could call kind of response bias, what it is that people want us to see, and the interviews and having interviews from various participants, you know, those within the school, the teachers, the principals, the parents, and eventually the kids, looking at different ways of approaching a similar kinds of questions will perhaps, you know, shed more light on that. I mean, we'll just have to wait and see.
Thanks, both of you. We have a couple of questions from Anissa and Melissa. I think these will be questions that will be a bit recurring across the session today. So we'll see if we can return to them in talks that are coming up, if not at the end. Our second speaker today is Linda Marsden, and she's doing a PhD in the Institute as well as the Young and Resilient Research Centre, and is talking to us today about her completion of the dissertation during this pandemic. Linda.
So as Ned just indicated, this presentation today is based on my PhD research, and Dancing with COVID-19 is actually the current title of my methods chapter. Throughout the presentation, I'll give a brief overview of how my methods responded to the complexity and uncertainty of doing my data collection under pandemic conditions, and some of the lessons that I've learned throughout that period. Briefly, my research is interested in young people's health, identity, selfies, and social media, and specifically how they understand and make sense of health and body-related images online. So this slide here gives a high-level overview of the project timeline and the points at which I needed to reorientate my research to the changing conditions. So I started with Plan A in January of last year in a pre-lockdown phase of COVID. I then went into the lockdown phase during April, May, June, July, and then completed my data collection in the new normal as we here in Queensland were coming out of lockdown. I'll go through each of these phases in more detail. So Plan A is basically what I received ethics approval for at the end of 2019. And during this phase, I worked with 6 participants who were all interested and engaged in the research process. They were highly accomplished and motivated young people. They're in their senior years of high school or in undergrads at uni, and the artifacts they produced, one of which you can see on the slide here, were creative and interesting, and our discussions were really great. So it was a very seamless kind of period of the data collection phase. Unfortunately, it wasn't to last. And so in March, we went into lockdown, and I, like everybody else, not knowing how long the pandemic was going to last for, started considering how I was going to complete my thesis in these kind of conditions. So this is where I learned my first lesson about researching in uncertain times, and that was about maintaining integrity. I went back to my methodology textbooks and attended seminars and considered a variety of ways that I could collect data using secondary materials. But in the end, I came full circle and decided that, as we know, research must have both structural integrity and moral integrity. And to me, hearing and elevating young people's voices was my ethical commitment, and it was a foundation necessary to completion and answering my research question. So I stuck with my methods and became newly determined to talk to young people directly, even if we were physically distanced. So during May, I applied for ethics amendment for my project, established a project page on my website, and developed a range of digital materials that would allow me to continue my research online. During this phase, I used Padlet as an online whiteboard, one of which you can see on this slide here, and Zoom to conduct interviews with each participant. The biggest challenge I experienced in this phase was lead conversion. As a result of my recruitment through social media and other networks, I had about a dozen people express interest, but confirming an interview time with them was a struggle. And in the end, I only had 3 young people complete the interview. I worried initially about data consistency, but again, I had interested young people who were engaged in the topic, and apart from the lack of the group aspects, the data generated was very similar in quality and type to previous phase. But I still only had 9 participants, and I knew I needed many more, and I was really relieved when the restrictions began to ease here in Queensland, because I could look to alternative terms of going back face to face. But this is where I learnt my second lesson. I've maintained online recruitment and methods. And as Greg and Megan have just noted, it's very difficult to work with schools and universities during this phase. And that was one of my key recruitment channels. So what I did in the end to recruit more participants, I started cold calling organisations that worked with young people in the Greater Brisbane area, and this required persistence. There was many follow-ups and leading to zero interest in my project until eventually one organisation invited me to come and speak with their clients. So this particular organisation is phase 3 of my research, and this organisation provided employment and training services for young people who had not been succeeding in the education system. Most had completed year 10, but not all of them had. And this was absolutely where my biggest lessons were learned. I'd planned to go straight back to the same research tools I'd started with in Plan A. However, working in the centre and with a group of young people with very different characteristics to those that I had imagined when creating those research tools, threw up completely new and unanticipated challenges. The group of young people tended to be suspicious of newcomers, so I needed to spend a lot more time developing rapport. These young people were also challenging to engage and maintain attention. Participants would just come and go throughout workshops, attend some days, not others. And the centre had its own priorities and needs that I needed to accommodate. Some days I would arrive ready to run a workshop and find another guest speaker there ready to begin. But I think what I found the most challenging was finding a common language. The background to this slide is data from a photo elicitation exercise, and it might give you a sample as to how these young people communicated. These people use language very differently to what I was familiar with, and I had to spend a lot of time interpreting, clarifying, and seeking to understand. My ability to convey complex concepts in simple language was also really challenged. And despite, to my mind, the activities being simple and fun, many of them didn't participate because of their perceptions about their handwriting or their spelling skills. I also worried constantly about the tension between procedural and practical consent with young people. All of them had signed the consent form, but fluctuating levels of enthusiasm made me reflexive about the ways they may have been demonstrating resistance to the process. In the end, I adopted a much more ethnographic approach, spending several days a week with them over a period of months. However, this in itself evolved and just changed continually. For me, it was just about constantly adapting. Some days I'd arrive ready for interviews and be told that the young people I'd needed to meet with had gone out to work on site. So I'd just stay and help others with applications or other tasks. Overall, it was a huge lesson in being flexible and responsive. I never quite knew what the day would bring, and so I just seized opportunities as they arose. So in summary, the lessons that I've learned for researching in uncertain times have been as follows. Maintain integrity to your research question and to your values. Be persistent and creative. There's always a workaround to the obstacles in our way. It's just about continuing to try new things, think creatively until we find a solution that works. And think on your feet. Research rarely goes exactly to plan. Being flexible, adaptive, and reflexive means that we can still achieve our research goals and sometimes even achieve a better outcome. So this last slide is what I felt like after 12 months of just spinning in circles, constantly thinking reflexively and responding to new circumstances. I needed to just stop, process, and integrate. The last site research site especially affected me. It really made me question my identity as a researcher. And as challenging it was, I'm grateful because I've learned a lot more. I've become a lot more resilient researcher and have a far more fascinating and diverse data set than I would have had otherwise. And most importantly, the group of young people that I ended up working the majority of the time with are often marginalized and silenced. And now I've got the privilege of amplifying their voices and their experiences so that we can learn from them. So that's my experience of conducting research in uncertain times. And I'm very happy to answer questions that anyone might have.
Well, thanks very much, Linda. And thanks a lot for your wonderful kind of time scheduling there. We've got a great question here from Tendai. Would you like to ask that or reiterate that, Tendai?
Thanks, Ned. Now, I was just asking whether any of the colleagues who have presented so far have had to use research assistants and whether that has required any significant change or approach. What are some of the challenges or experiences that you might have come across using research assistants in the context of the changed environment? Or maybe it might apply to other speakers who might come on later on. Thank you.
I will defer that to Megan or Greg, because as my my own PhD research, I wasn't using research assistants, no.
Yeah, I think Shanthi might actually pick up on this later. I'll just say that we have one research assistant working with us, and because she has worked closely with us all the way along, she was sort of she is an integral part of the project. So that it hasn't really presented any problems, but I think what I know of what Shanthi is going to speak about there, she may pick up on that, Tendai. So.
I mean, there's a way we could rephrase this question that might be a bit more aligned with your research, Linda, and that's to do with, how we think about collective or collaborative forms of knowledge production. And while categorically in the university we have to deal with this unit called research assistant, in the field, where you're talking with people, you're kind of engaged in what is sort of often fashionably called co-design. These are people who are sort of informing, of course, and producing the type of analysis and knowledge that you develop out of your thesis. So that might be another way of casting it. To what level of sort of agency, I guess, might you give to some of the people you're working with in terms of, producing the findings that you've got from your thesis?
I think that's a really interesting question, Ned, because that was absolutely my goal at the outset of the research process, was to co-design and co-develop the research outcomes. But I did find that was extremely challenging throughout the whole COVID experience, because everybody's priorities were just suddenly shifted. And particularly with the group that I ended up working with towards the end, I could just see that my research project was very low on their list of priorities in their life. I'm not sure if that answers the question directly.
Well, we could keep on talking, but I'm grabbed here by Catherine's, kind of quite provocative question here. Would you like to have a look at that? Or Catherine, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, Catherine, the question there is, in what sense do you think the resulting research produced more interesting results? I think it more interesting in that, as I indicated towards the end, this is typically a group of young people who are marginalized or silenced, and we don't necessarily get to hear or see their experiences of social media or experience their selfie behavior. And so it was far more interesting for me to get their perceptions as to the kind of discourse that we get from maybe our own children or other teenagers that we know. I found it to be quite a striking difference between what the common discourse is and what the reality was in these young people's lives.
We've got the time for one more, and Dave has brought up the conundrum of ethics again, and whether any modifications were needed here.
Yes, so David, I did apply twice for different ethics amendments. So I did receive my approval at the end of 2019, and I applied for an ethics amendment to move online in May, I think it was. And then I also did another amendment as I was working with my final site, just to note the increased vulnerability of the people that I was working with and the slightly changed methodological approach. So yes, 2 ethics amendments in there. And I think somebody also asked about timelines blowing out. And I'll just quickly address that, because I had anticipated a 6 to 9 month period of data collection, and it ended up to be just over 12. So I was really grateful for that to have not blown out so far. But I think a lot of that is really down to that kind of creativity and persistence. I was just determined to collect the data in a reasonable time period, and that's what I was able to do.
Well, it's amazing you're able to work through those circumstances in the way you have, Linda. So thanks a lot for that, and we'll move on to the third speaker now, Dr. Ben Hanckel, who's a sociologist of youth, gender and sexuality and public health.
Great, thanks Ned. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Good to see everyone, or at least kind of virtually be here with everyone. So today what I want to do is, I guess, build on some of the themes that have come up so far, and really reflect on this idea of uncertainty in relation to some of the interview and focus group work that I've done in the past, over the past year. So over the past, or since 2020 and since the pandemic, has started, I've worked on 3 different projects that have all included interviews or focus groups with young people. And so this first one is around social media use with sexuality and gender diverse young people. I've also looked at an evaluation of a mental health digital platform, as well as a more recent project on financial technologies and young people's use of them and their well-being. And what I want to kind of draw out throughout this discussion, I guess, is kind of how I've kind of used online focus groups, but how this has kind of shifted because of the pandemic and interviews, how that's kind of shifted because of the online pandemic or the pandemic more generally. So Lausanne says in their work, the new mediated practices resume past performances, speeches, values, interactions, and situations. We do what we used to do, but with new participants. So we might use Zoom, for instance, in focus groups and interviews, and in this reconfigured environment, different ways, different times, places, meanings, and subjects emerge, involved in similar activities, interactions, or relationships and interactions. And what I'm particularly interested here then, and what came out, I guess, from kind of reflecting on some of the research that I've done, is kind of looking at how these times of uncertainty have kind of reshaped risk in terms of online focus groups and interviews, and also reshaped intimacy as well, particularly around topics that have looked at young people's experiences who are marginalized and who face stigma, but also the kind of work that has to go into kind of being a researcher as well in these spaces. So what I want to do is kind of deep dive into this particular project, or zoom in on this project as a way to kind of flesh out some of these themes that have emerged. This project, as I said, was looking at young people's social media use who are sexuality and gender diverse. In total, my colleague and Dr. Chandra and I undertook 10 focus groups and 21 interviews with 65 LGBTQIA+ young people from around Australia who are 16 to 30 years old. I'll just go through the process of what we did and how that kind of shifted and kind of, I guess, reshaped, or risk was kind of reshaped and imagined through a period of uncertainty. So I want to start with recruitment. So in terms of recruitment, we recruited through Facebook and Instagram, and you can kind of see, I think on your top left of your screens there, the recruitment image that we used that was linked to a screening survey where there was more information about the study, but also what I think is important was a link to my own researcher profile and information about my publications and history and trajectory, as well as a request for participants to provide safe contact details. what I think was particularly interesting in putting out this, and what I kind of hadn't anticipated, was that during the process of recruitment that we would be faced with quite a lot of hate speech online. So there was kind of daily accounts of homophobia and transphobia directed at the research, potential participants and ourselves, the researchers, which required daily removal of comments to kind of create a safe space that would link people to the study. What I guess quite a lot of emotional labor kind of goes into that, a lot of debriefing behind the scenes to kind of make decisions about what gets removed and what doesn't, which helps, I guess, when you have multiple researchers on the study and the space to have those conversations. But because of platform functions or affordances of the platform, there's certain things that we couldn't remove, such as the angry emoji in the comment, in the reactions section. But what was interesting, and I can talk more about this if people are interested, but I think it was interesting that almost this kind of sense of community or allyship emerged in response to the angry emoji and the use of those reactions on the recruitment advertisement itself, which I think is quite fascinating to kind of think through how this, I guess, the space of understanding LGBT social media use for us kind of started in the recruitment process itself, but also required quite a lot of emotional labor and investment on our time as well. Sorry. In terms of the process of working together, I won't say too much about the actual research work that working online during a pandemic entails. I think a lot of us know. I think Shanti's going to pick up on some of those themes as well. But it did require a lot of ensuring that we had everything in secure stored secure spaces online, where we were all working together as researchers with shared documents, and data storage was all very carefully put in place. But what I want to talk about, I guess, was trying to work online with young people, and in particular in this research project, it required ensuring that we mitigated risks, so providing young people with resources that gave them information about not only the study, but also information about Zoom, how to use Zoom, how to change their name if they didn't necessarily want to come up as a with the participant name with their username, with their name on the Zoom screen, as well as ensuring that they had space to kind of include their pronouns, et cetera, et cetera. But also required a lot of emails just back and forth, ensuring participants understood what participation meant, and reminders about the focus groups coming up as well. Things that we would have done probably, just perhaps a bit differently when it came to face-to-face interactions, but also required being clear about the time zones, given people were meeting in from different geographic spaces in Australia. We also provided young people with an activity to do beforehand. And I mentioned this because I think it was a really useful activity to get young people thinking about and comfortable with coming online and talking about their experiences, particularly marginalized young people, from a space where they might not have been comfortable doing that, but also provided an object that they could talk about in the actual interviews and focus groups themselves, where they could reflect on and show it and talk to it instead of having to directly discuss or look at the camera and see themselves. And one of the activities, they're an artifact from the researchers on the screen now. In terms of what was really interesting for me is kind of thinking about this, where new risks kind of emerged. So what I want to kind of reflect on here was just how a lot of LGBT young people came on the screen, came on focus groups and interviews. We weren't necessarily aware of who else was physically in the space with them when we were doing those interviews. In one particular case, there was a transgender young person who couldn't speak about their experiences because their family was in the adjacent room and they weren't sure when they were going to walk into the space. So they ended up typing out a lot of their responses, and as well as kind of using the artifact that I showed you on the last slide as a tool to kind of talk about it in a very coded way, talk about their experiences in a coded way, which I thought was quite interesting. People also had to go outside. We had people in focus groups and in interviews in cars, in parks, and cameras were on at times. Sometimes cameras were off. And I think there's a question there about I guess why cameras were off. I think sometimes it was to avoid being seen and known, but I think there was also for some people a sense of shame about where they were, sorry, and where they were located, and the homes in which they're based in. But at the same time, and I think this is one, I guess, where this is a positive of doing a lot of these focus groups, is that a lot of young people took us into their bedrooms, into their private spaces in houses where they felt very comfortable. They could kind of talk and be quite, I felt safe in those spaces. And so these kind of spaces of intimacy emerged, where we saw at times a lot of gamer paraphernalia, a lot of like things that they talked about in the interviews with us about being important in the background as they were talking on their beds. Cats would walk across the screen and we would all laugh. It was a very jovial kind of intimate energy and atmosphere, I think, that was kind of created from this the participants engaging in this space. And I also say that Zoom itself, because of its affordances, enabled the possibilities for young people to use filters for fun and identity making, which we could actually refer to in the interviews and focus groups, which I think built on an understanding of the sense of these young people who we were talking to. Just in terms of some of the, I guess, things that we put in place just to make sure that we could mitigate risk and support the agency of these young people, required ensuring there were pre-briefing, debriefing for focus groups to check their safety, sometimes through text, or through typing, I should say, and confirming a safe space for everyone who was there, particularly in focus groups. Providing them with the option to turn off cameras, microphones, or switch off Zoom if required, typing, as I said, comments rather than voice, and giving participants support information for after the focus group. And I can talk through that a bit more, which is mental health resources. And Ned, I did hear your timer go off, so I will kind of summarize now. Really, I think that the interesting thing here is how, I guess we've been doing online focus groups and online interviews for a while. I think though that the pandemic shifts and reshapes risk, and for the young people who I've spoken to who are sexuality and gender diverse and who might be dealing with various mental health issues and the stigmas attached to those, actually talking about that in spaces where their families are a lot closer and they're all the time because of lockdown really shifts our ways of, should shift, I should say, our ways of engaging with them and thinking through the possibilities and risks of engaging in this space. And I've kind of put there, I think that we can implement more opportunities for young people to feel like they're in control and curate space, but also provides opportunities for us to bring people together from various geographic locations with less resources, perhaps for researchers who don't have to set up a whole space in a physical location to create face-to-face engagement. And I think that can be one of the other benefits of this as well. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Ben. I'm conscious of time here. So we'll move now to our final speaker, Associate Professor Shanthi Robertson, who's a sociologist and researcher of migration and transnationalism, as well as issues around citizenship, multiculturalism, and diversity.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the intro, Ned. And thanks, Elise, for doing my screen share. I'm not going to talk too much today about specific projects or methods, but actually just some sort of reflections around research as a work practice that I've found personally productive to think about over the last couple of years. There are two kind of caveats here. This is based largely on my own reflections and experiences and conversations with colleagues. So I am an associate professor and I do mostly funded research. So I have a lot of resources and a lot of support, and I acknowledge many of you are probably trying to battle through under very different circumstances. So I hope there's still something helpful in here. And second, although I'm sort of talking a little bit about tips to survive researching in our current environment, I don't want to individualize what are systemic problems. You cannot productivity hack or project manage your way out of the stress of researching in a pandemic. I've tried, it doesn't work, nor out of the structural systemic issues that are really kind of plaguing our sector. So collective resistance to some of these issues is really important, and hopefully events like this do enable us to further that discussion. So I guess my central thought here is that what if we really think about our work culture as part of our research culture, instead of just thinking about, okay, the work of research is grant writing, data collection, analysis, writing papers. If we start thinking, okay, research practice is also emails and team meetings and conversations and to-do lists and where you save your files and what software you're using to gather and analyze your data and the text messages you send to your research partners and raising your invoices and staring at your budget spreadsheets. And as Shiva and Ben both raised, the emotional labour and the care work that happens between each other as colleagues with our research participants and our partners. And I think it's these micro practices of research work that we don't talk about enough. And when some of these things around management, administration, communication and relationships are not working, it can be very hard to move research forward. The pandemic's created almost this kind of space where all of us need to individually and collectively rethink the way we do some of this stuff. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that some of the expectations and practices that just snuck in on us in 2020, the quadrupling of email volume, the 8 hours of back-to-back Zoom meetings, the relentless crisis admin forms, the getting up at 3 a.m. to do international presentations in another time zone, these are really damaging to actual research productivity and to research excellence. The articles in my slide provide some very solid evidence on this. And even the most, notoriously cutthroat corporate workplaces in Australia are not asking some of these things of their staff. They actually acknowledge that there isn't really a productivity dividend or a wellbeing dividend around some of these practices. I do think that this year and the second lockdown, I feel that we are being a bit more reflective and careful about this, which is positive, but I think we need to keep actively resisting and reflecting on our shifting research cultures. And, to focus on some of those micro practices of culture and relationships rather than just focusing on policy. So Elise, can you flick to the next slide, please? So these are just kind of questions that I don't have answers to that I've been thinking about. How do we build respect and transparency for changing work practices around research? And how do we think about collective change? And I think what's helped me is trying to have a bit more empathy that different people actually do have different ways of working and different needs around this stuff. And that we need to be upfront and transparent about our expectations for working together in our collaborations, whether that's with colleagues, within the university, with our partners, with our students. And this is actually around the micro stuff. Turnaround times, meeting frequency, collaboration tools, email etiquette, roles and responsibilities, and someone raised research assistants, and certainly in our onboarding and our ongoing mentoring of research assistants, we need to be transparent about this stuff. For those of us who work across multiple projects across different parts of the university or of different partners in industry, which is certainly the circumstances I'm in, we're really hyper aware there's no one formula for getting this stuff right. Whenever we start a new project team or a new writing collaboration or a new working party, we actually should be having these conversations and keep having them rather than thinking that there's one mainstream approach that's going to work for every team or group. I do think that there's some power in being transparent with each other about why some things aren't going to work for us. Ben, for example, is my mentee. He knows how much I hate Zoom, and he's very good about just doing a 1990 style phone call when we need to have a nice chat. And they're often like the best bits of the week when I'm actually just on the phone and not on Zoom. But, even the out of office messages, the email signatures that set some boundaries around what you can do and when. And I think if you are a solo researcher and you're not working in teams, that's also a conversation you can have with yourself. What can you progress? What do you objectively have capacity to work on, given the circumstances of the week or the month? So, have that conversation with yourself. If you know you're going to be exhausted after 6 hours of teaching, release the expectation that you're going to write that afternoon. Maybe focus on reading something, some data coding, organizing your references, building some connections with other researchers, or just, resting the brain, because all of that stuff is still actually research work. So it's about, I do hate this word, but that intentionality, I think, around work practice and boundaries, and awareness as well of how our practices, even unintentionally, do set cultural precedents for others. I have been mucking this up all the time. Last weekend, I sent a very lovely colleague an email on a Saturday because it was just, I needed to clear my inbox. She emailed back on a Sunday, and the first line of her email was, "I'm sorry for the delayed response." And I thought, oh no, I've just set a precedent that I expect emails to come back to me on the weekend. That's something that I need to fix. We've got to normalize pushing back on some of these things that are just bad practice, that are not working for a lot of people in the group. But I will say it is the responsibility of our senior people to make the effort to notice when these things are not working, including for our casual staff and our HDRs, and to do something about it. if you're in a position where you are junior or precarious and you feel like these practices are not working for you and you don't think you can push back, please try and identify and find some of the safe senior people who will have that conversation for you, or talk to the people around you to see if they're having similar issues so you can work together on a collective response. I will say we do have research leaders. I'm extremely lucky to have ICS Director Heather Horst and School of Humanities and Communication Arts Associate Research Dean Anna Pertiera, who are the types of leaders who will listen to these issues and will take sensible action where they can on this stuff. If everyone could lead research a little bit more like them, that would be excellent. Next slide, please, Elise. The other thing I wanted to quickly explore is to kind of recognise that sometimes the tools we have the most immediate access to at the university are not always fit for purpose and might not be the best tools for our research collaborations. I've chucked a few things on the slide here that I have used or colleagues have recommended to me. This is kind of a controversial subject around ethics, risk and data management in terms of the things that the university would prefer that we use. But a lot of these tools are free, they are open source. There are many ways, I think, to use them as teams and individuals where you don't need to put sensitive information on there or breach any data or privacy policies. And I think, again, this is a space where we can kind of push back a bit, that we need as researchers tools that work for us. Our partners, Ben and I have had a lot of conversations around this. Our partners work routinely with far more agile research and collaboration tools than we do. So it's about our partnerships as well. And I think flexibility is really key here. We don't want an over-surveilled environment where every project has to use the same software or the same templates and that things have to be signed off by your dean. We should be in a position where we're trying to empower research teams and researchers to make their own decisions about what best practice collaboration tools are for their projects and disciplines. But also, I think, again, coming back to empathy, that some of our colleagues do not have the bandwidth or desire to learn new systems when they're already really overloaded. So again, coming back to transparent conversations about what is going to work for you as a team and the willingness to have some failed experiments around how we collaborate, having some forethought for different circumstances. Just as an example, as a full-time academic with multiple projects who completely cannot handle her Outlook inbox, I love a Teams channel or a WhatsApp group for kind of rapid fire team comms, but I need to make it really clear when I onboard casual staff like research assistants, if they're on hourly contracts, that they're not expected to reply to those communications outside of paid hours. And I have to stick to that, even if that's not the most efficient kind of communication stream for me. And you can also use some of this stuff as an individual. I think even if my teams don't want to look at my nifty project planning spreadsheet or use an Asana task list, and sometimes they don't, I can still use them for myself in ways that can actually help me to manage my workload and my mental load. My final point, Elise, can you flick back to slide 2? Is that okay? My final point is just to have a bit of a think on the relationship side around networks and mentors and how you need these to work, because they probably do need to work differently now in this current research environment. So, thoughtfulness around what you need, a venting space and accountability space. Do you need people to help you upskill in some new methods or approaches? I certainly need all of the above on a rolling basis, but I'm probably not going to get them from one person or one network. I think that kind of traditional academic model that you have one senior professor as your guru and your guide in research is not working that well for a lot of people in the current environment, because careers just look so different now from 5 or even 10 years ago. And one of my biggest saving grace in the last 2 years is the building of networks with people in research or research-like roles outside of the university sector. I mean, often any project-based knowledge work is going to have a lot of work practice crossover with academia. So I have a brains trust that give me lots of sense checking on my work practice, and they sit across, like user experience research and technology, policy research and NGOs, and public health research. And it's really helpful. We're an odd insular world sometimes in academia, so it helps a lot, particularly with these issues of crisis and contingency, to check in with external people who are doing similar work, but whose organisational cultures are quite different. Is that my time up, Ned?
It is. I had
done.
The politeness to cancel the alarm. But thanks a lot, Shanthi, for those insights and reflections. There's a lot that you put on the table there that's certainly challenging for many aspects of how the university runs and understands itself. Do we have any questions coming up from people here? I mean, Shanthi, one of the things I found exciting about your, provocations in many ways was that I guess it was a kind of, certainly informal license to have some confidence in ourselves to make decisions that, do fly under the radar of protocol. And it's a delicate line there, of course, because it can place us in, vulnerable positions that vary, of course, depending on our types of position in the university. And there isn't going to be a one-line answer that you have for this, I'm sure, but it does throw up the complexity of the university as an organization in quite a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not kind of recommending people do their own thing and fly under the radar, actually, but I'm just kind of recommending that we have a conversation and acknowledge that we are a really diverse organization and that the research we conduct and the teams we form, there isn't a one size fits all way to manage collaboration and communication in those teams. And that, a lot of kind of inefficiency and stress comes from trying to find one approach that works across disciplines. If we really do want to work in a way that is bold and in a way that encourages interdisciplinarity and, partnership across different forms of industry and community, we do have to think in a bit more of a creative and agile way about some of these questions. And again, with all the attentiveness to risk and privacy and safety and all of that stuff, those things are still really, really important, obviously. It'd just be good to have a few more robust discussions, I think.
Certainly. Isaac, we have a question here from you around assistive technologies team at Western Sydney. Do you have some familiarity with that, Shanthi?
Only a very little bit, actually. I don't know if Karen is here, but she would probably have more to say. So we have had to try with one of our projects, which is working with participants living with disability, to take the online data collection and remote data collection and make sure it's accessible. To do it, really properly and really well, it is quite challenging and quite expensive, depending on what kind of accessibility you're dealing with. I do think on the teaching side, the university is doing incredibly well on accessibility with online learning, and I actually think researchers could probably learn a little bit from TNL and how accessibility is managed there.
I mean, one of the other really kind of key points I found that you made in your talk there was just this blurring of boundaries in many ways between what our kind of formal, if you like, objects of research are, or topics, particularly in relation to funded research, and then just the way in which these really become, I guess, interwoven with the kind of micro practices that you were referring to. And this really unsettles, regardless of the pandemic, because those types of practices are always there. Certainly they're amplified at the moment, but it unsettles the idea of some sort of coherent disciplinarity and wants to kind of push back and test that in ways. I mean, there's been a lot of great research around critiques of the university for, decades that follow that kind of line, but it's not the one that's comfortable very often for many disciplines at the association level, for instance.
Yeah, I think it can be an uncomfortable discussion for sure. But I think the other presenters, in talking about the methods that they've deployed to kind of continue and to have research continuity in this rapidly changing environment, I think they've all illustrated that it is that flexibility and willingness to negotiate and kind of creativity and reflection. That's actually what drives these projects that have been showcased today forward. That's what makes them successful. So, those are the kind of skills I think that we should be fostering in our research culture.
We have a few minutes left. Do we have some final questions that people would like to raise, or other topics that weren't addressed?
Can I just pick up on a point that Shanthi made, about flexibility? What I saw coming through in the various presentations was also the idea of perseverance. Perseverance and being quite dogged about what what it is that you want to do becomes really important. the point that Greg and I raised about the gatekeepers in terms of our research. I mean, it's very easy to get a negative response, and you can just think, oh, okay, well, I'll just sit back and I'll wait till COVID's over or whatever. But you have to persist, and you have to think of other ways around that. I mean, as Linda indicated, there are ethical issues around that. I mean, you have to be aware of the kinds of issues that a lot of our participants are faced with. But at the same time, there is a certain persistence that not just that you want to get the research done, but particularly if it is funded research, you're responsible for public money, and you know, what are you doing with it during that period of time? So I think flexibility is coupled with persistence, and those are two sort of really important qualities that come to the fore during COVID.
I mean, you've opened up a potential can of worms there, Megan, and I'm not going to take the invitation, actually. But certainly expenditure of money is a real challenge for those of us who are holding grants, and being held to, you know, a line that goes in an application and then the post-award amount that's inevitably diminished.
Yeah,
I mean, talk about the micro practices of research. You know, how much time do you spend trying to negotiate those types of issues?
That has made, you know, that is one thing that has made the kind of idea of the pivot and the idea of contingency and, you know, thinking about flexible ways to do research. That's one of the things that's made it really hard. That's one of the things that's kind of obstructing that thinking. So maybe there's a larger conversation to be had around that. And again, of course, you know, transparent and rigorous budgeting is really, really important. But at what point does it stop kind of serving our interests in terms of research excellence?
Absolutely. We're coming towards an end. If there's a final question, it'd be really great to hear that. Otherwise, for those of you who are still here, it would be, you know, interesting if you feel at all inclined or have the time or compulsion to send through some thoughts you might have on other types of topics you're interested in that we could organise across ICS and university. Around conducting research during what's going to be, I guess, this shift from pandemic to something that's more endemic and longer term, and how we're having to really kind of recast, as we've heard today, in often very dramatic ways, the kind of expectations certainly that we have for our research and the ways in which we undertake that and carry it out. We're always keen to get that type of input from people across the university and enter those kinds of dialogues, certainly beyond ICS. So if that's all, I will bring the meeting to a close. And thank you to our speakers and Elise for helping out as always. And for people coming along today, it's great to see such a great turnout.